Overcoming by Purefoy's Girl. Chapter 25. The sun was already moving toward the horizon before Hannibal set out to return to Marsham Heath, plans settled behind him and the whole affair put to rest. By this time next week, Galleyfield would be as empty and quiet as it had been when he'd first arrived there over 6 years ago, fuming and hurt, and plagued by nightmares to take up residence in isolation. His life couldn't be more different now. That which he had sought to escape, he now rode towards, eager and anxious to be reunited. Will's image blazed in his mind, in his heart, a brilliant light that he strained to reach. He tried, and failed, to plan what he would say to Will. He never could predict his mate in anything, and did not trouble himself to do anything more than be prepared to tell him the truth, now that he had the details to supply in answer to the questions Will would most certainly ask him. The little city of Moseley was lit by the time they passed through on their path to Marsham Heath, and the capital was a haze on the horizon. The cloud of smog that had accumulated through the day reflected a yellow glow from the many street lamps, the light visible even from this distance. The lamps at Marsham Heath were lit as well, a welcoming, beckoning path to guide him home, and Hannibal urged his horse faster, saying, "Quickly now, Verger, we might make dinner." "That'd be welcome, my lord," Verger called, his sturdy little horse catching up quickly. Mr. Thatcher had the door open right as he reached it, leaving Verger to hand the horses off. "Have I missed dinner, Thatch?" "No, my lord. However, his lordship has requested a tray in his suite," Mr. Thatcher said, locking up the front door for the night. "Just as well. The dining room truly isn't as we should prefer. Would you like me to send a tray to your suite as well?" "Has it gone up yet?" "No, my lord, not quite as yet," Mr. Thatcher said, shuffling to his side. He should have been retired 10 years ago, Hannibal realized. It was certainly time for him to honor his duty to the people in the Lecter family's care. Hannibal debated a moment, long enough that Mr. Thatcher asked, "Should there be some change, my lord?" "No, Thatch, do as he said," Hannibal told him. "But hold the tray for a moment. I'll send Verger down with some instructions." "Yes, my lord," Thatcher said, and shuffled off as Hannibal moved rapidly upstairs. Marsham Heath was not nearly on as grand a scale as Hertford House, being mostly a hunting retreat, but it was comfortable, and boasted a very well-kept, spacious library, due to the 5th Duke's aversion to hunting, despite the predilection his spouse had for it. Hannibal thanked his good luck to have such an educated-minded ancestor for making such a lovely room, and laid his plans as he cleared up and changed his clothes. "Ah, Verger," he said when his valet returned, and finished penning his small note. He folded it and handed it to Verger, along with an antique silver box he'd claimed out of his belongings at Galleyfield. "Here, take these below stairs and see that they are put on Will's tray. Be sure they stay there, mind. I don't want these wandering off." "Course, my lord," Verger said, taking the items. "Anything more?" "Yes, some," Hannibal said, taking a deep breath to calm his growing nerves. "Here's what I need you to do." A soft knock on the door drew Will's attention from the plans he was reviewing, and he glanced up. "Come in." Francis moved through the doorway and to one side, saying, "It's one of the servants with a tray, Mr. Graham." "Very good, Francis, thank you," Will said, and paused in his perusal of the estate papers when the footman bore his tray in, nervous of Francis glowering at him. "Francis, you may go downstairs and have your supper," Will urged him, wondering how the man could stand such constant, intense watchfulness. "Thank you, my lord," he said, and Will resolved to send him off for breaks more often, if only to have a few moments to himself. The footman lifted the tray lid and stepped back, awaiting approval. "Thank you," Will murmured, but checked his move to approve it when he spied a very costly-looking antique silver box atop a folded piece of paper. What on earth? His heart pounded, no little part of him fearing this would be another threat, that Marsham Heath was no more safe than Hertford House, that they would have to pack everything up and move again, and even Hannibal might not be able to find him. His hands trembled as he unfolded it, but he resolutely began to read. "Will, please do me the honor and grace me with the pleasure of your company in the library, where we may share a simple dinner together. If you prefer to eat alone in your room, of course I will not resent you. I only wish to see you for a time before sleep takes us both to morning. Please find with this note a token of my esteem. I hope you will wear it with pleasure, knowing that it is precious to me, and with the expectation that my affections follow the giving, without presumption for their return. Yours, Hannibal.
Will read it twice, and looked up at the footman bewildered. "When did his lordship return?" he asked, the words firm and even. He folded the note and tucked it into his waistcoat pocket behind his watch, fingers lingering over it and heart pounding.
"Half an hour and more ago, my lord," he was told, and Will glanced in the direction of Hannibal's suite, wondering that he had not heard him. "Is the tray to your liking?"
The tray will do nicely, thank you. Only give me a moment, please," Will said, and picked up the antique box. It was weighty and silky cold, warming to the touch of his fingers as if waking from a long slumber. He couldn't resist running his fingertips over the filigree, admiring the intricacy of work done, swirling vines and curled leaves and doves in various stages of repose. Will thumbed the small catch and slowly slid the lid open. The red velvet lining was aged but vibrant. The scent of roses and faint perfume drifted up to him, the captured memory of someone who had once treasured the gift. A silver ring lay within, half as long as Will's ring finger, a stunning piece of art from a master craftsman. There were no jewels, nothing ostentatious to detract from the delicate swirls and crests that made an absent picture which called to mind water flowing. The longer Will looked at it, the more he saw the suggestion of a stag's rack, the barest flash of a fish scale, a wonderland of fey forest creatures half in hiding in a landscape of silver. Will swallowed hard when he turned the ring over and saw etched into the back, "Saule, my fairy queen, with all my love, Cyrus." Will put it back in the box with reverence, respectful of its meaning. Hannibal, he surmised, had very few mementos of the mother he had never met, and he had trusted this one to Will's hands.
I hope you will wear it with pleasure, knowing that it is precious to me, and with the expectation that my affections follow the giving, without presumption for their return. I have some business to take care of at Galley Field. When I return this evening, there is a great deal I should like to tell you, but I must get everything settled before I attempt to do so.
Will closed the box, taking a deep breath that still held the tang of perfume and roses. His faith had been thoroughly shaken by Hannibal's quick defection, the part of him that was his father's son condemning his actions from fear. It shamed him to know it, but the longer he had reflected on it, the more he realized that it was infinitely easier to believe the worst of his husband than it was to believe that Hannibal might choose to put aside the life he loved for him.
My lord?
Will looked up at the footman as he stood, donning his jacket with haste and clutching the box in his hand. "Please take my tray back downstairs and let the staff have it if they wish," he said, moving toward the door. "I will be joining Lord Clarges in the library."
"Yes, my lord." I hope you will wear it with pleasure, knowing that it is precious to me, and with the expectation that my affections follow the giving.
It kept echoing in Will's mind's eye as if Hannibal had reached inside him and written it in his flesh. Those were not the sentiments of a man who intended to forsake him. Those were the sentiments of the man who had held his hand and gazed at him with tears painting trails down his stark cheekbones, insisting he regretted what had passed between them, insisting that he would bring their shattered potential together again. Will's heart refused to slow its pace, thundering away in his chest while heat prickled his skin. He took the main stairs to the ground floor and paused before the library door, suddenly nervous and uncertain, questioning himself, sure that he was misconstruing his husband's intentions. The cliff that haunted his nightmares was there, in the back of his mind, taunting him with its presence. The sheer drop it offered was almost as deadly as the feeling that woke in Will's heart at the thought of his husband. The two were intimately tied together. To love was the act of a fool. To be loved was simply inconceivable. To have both was to plunge from that cliff-top without hope of rescue or surety of the future, and it nearly overcame him, but he refused to allow it. He chastised himself for a coward, had entered the library before he could go any further into that train of thought. A fire burned with cheery warmth in the fireplace, and several lamps were lit, throwing the room into a soft golden glow. A table had been set in the center of the room, a heavy candelabra lighting up a simple decoration of evergreen boughs with freshly cut flowers and 2 place settings. "Will," Hannibal said, moving from the shadows near the window where he'd been looking out at the city below. He was somber as he moved into the light, his warm scent curling through Will's senses and easing the tension that had risen since his departure. He drew a breath heavy with it, letting it wind through his senses with the promise of comfort. "I was told you had returned," he said, the words calm and soft. Yet when Hannibal heard them, he frowned in response to Will's reserve, knowing well enough what it hid.
"You thought I wouldn't,"
he said, stopping several feet away, giving Will room to feel unimpeded, whatever decision he might make. "I thought you would wish to visit with your family," Will said, marveling at his own even calm, relieved to feel his somber detachment stay firmly in place, despite the churning mire of emotions warring within him. "You do have a tendency to vanish."
"I have no intentions of vanishing on you again,"
Hannibal said, and his amber gaze dropped to the box Will held.
"How did you find my gift?"
"Beautiful," Will said, turning it once between his fingers with a small frown. He held it out to his husband, feeling a pang of disappointment from Hannibal like a physical touch. "I cannot accept it, Hannibal. It is indeed very precious, but both its meaning as well as your affections lie elsewhere." Hannibal made no move to touch the box or take it from him.
"No,"
he said, the single word vibrant and throaty, rumbling with the throbbing alpha undertone that reverberated through Will's chest all the way to his bones.
"They do not."
Will dropped his hand, holding the box against his stomach. He met Hannibal's piercing gaze, his blue eyes vivid and searching, braced as if for an oncoming storm. "You went to Galley Field, Hannibal," he said with a small wry smile, but it bothered him. It bothered him! It was more troubling to Will that he could properly make sense of, and it showed in the way his calm slipped just enough to bear the turmoil beneath.
"I did,"
Hannibal admitted, hands linked behind his back, angling his face down toward the firelight so that it chased his perfect profile in orange and gold.
"I went for several reasons, Will, one of which was to fetch my mother's ring for you. It is my only memento of her that I have. I knew you would appreciate its importance."
"I do, but I confess I do not understand, Hannibal," Will said, lips pressing close in what was almost a frown. "Why would you wish me to have this? And your note—"
"I wish for you to have it, Will, because you are the one who is most important to me,"
Hannibal said, reaching out to close Will's fingers over the box with a soft squeeze, the strength in his hands waking a keen desire in Will to feel more of its gentle touch. His piercing amber eyes searched out Will's, deep and filled with hope.
"And the note was the simple truth, Will. I would love nothing more than for you to wear her ring, and allow me to be your husband, in truth."
Will's full lips parted, half shock, half aborted speech. He bit down on his lower lip a moment before asking, "Did you say the same thing to Alana?"
"Alana has never seen nor touched this ring, and with good reason,"
Hannibal said, fingers curling over Will's hand in a soft caress.
"I have always kept it for the person I would share my life with as an equal. That person is you, Will. That person will always and only be you."
Will's long throat worked in a swallow, thoughts moiling in his eyes, yet he said nothing, was not able to give voice to the sudden silence in him like a pregnant pause that follows the tolling of a bell. All of his life, all he had ever wanted was to be part of a proper family, to be useful and important to someone, to have some small trace of love. And now his husband stood before him, speaking as if such a thing were truly possible. That is... His words escaped him. His arguments abandoned him. He wanted to remind Hannibal of all the reasons why such a thing could never be true, but every time he tried to do so, he found he couldn't.
"I apologize for being so forward, but I must speak my mind. There is so much I have to tell you, Will,"
Hannibal said, the heat of his body reaching Will even with distance, threaded with the enticing alpha scent of him.
"I wish to tell you everything, even the things which shame me."
"I told you before, your willingness to speak of that which shames you does you credit, Hannibal," Will said, grasping his self-control with all of his strength, wanting with everything in him to believe this could be true. He had fought so long alone that the prospect of Hannibal being in earnest almost overcame him. Almost.
Will, I have not always conducted myself in ways that make me proud, as you well know. You have borne the brunt of my failings and suffered the consequences of my actions. I fear to add to your knowledge and build a wall between us which can never be breached, yet I would not keep the least of it from you, though it may hurt you.
I will hear it, Will said, Hannibal's desperate anxiety filling him through his bond. It roused him to respond, to offer comfort which served to bring his scattered thoughts and emotions back under control. He covered Hannibal's hands with his own free one, and squeezed to get his attention, saying again, I will hear it, Hannibal, even the things that may hurt me. I have hurt before.
And I have been responsible for all too much of it. What wouldn't I do to spare you now?
To spare me is to pity me, Will said, his voice as firm as his conviction and just as unwavering. Tell me what you need to tell me, and I will decide when you have finished whether I will wear this ring or fling something at your head. It coaxed a smile from his sombre husband, and Hannibal chuckled, lifting Will's hands to his lips for a kiss and pressing his cheek against them like a great purring cat.
As you are my husband, then I shall do as you say. Come, join me. This is no more a tale for dinner than it is for a salon, but neither is it a story for an empty stomach.
That is rather dire, Will said, his nerves making another appearance as Hannibal seated him at their little dinner table and rang for service. He put the silver box down next to the centerpiece, admiring the gleam of firelight on its surface and the potential which lay within. Their dinner arrived without fanfare, and was unpacked with efficient haste, no doubt under Hannibal's instructions that they were to be left alone. Once they were, Hannibal took up his wine-glass and remarked,
I know you have heard of my exploits in the city, Will, and you have mentioned Alana Bloom, as well as my daughter. I realize that what I am to tell you will test your trust in me. I only ask that you hear me out before you decide whether you believe me or not.
Will took a sip of his own wine, and said, Very well, Lord Clarges. Proceed.
Alana Bloom is not now, and has never been my mistress,
Hannibal said, forsaking his food for the joy of watching his husband by firelight. The sight of Will was nearly as filling, he found, satisfying a hunger that had grown through the hours without him.
What we had was an arrangement. I promised to keep her and her family safe, and she promised to repay my kindness.
Safe from what, Hannibal? Will asked, noting how uneasy his husband was.
Miss Alana Bloom was once Mrs. Mason Verger,
Hannibal said, and Will sat back in his chair in surprise. Married? I expected a great many things, Hannibal, but not that. Is she the reason why you track Mason Verger?
For her sake, and for the sake of his twin sister, Margo, who lived with them when they were first wed,
Hannibal said, picking up his fork to take a few bites, fortification for what was to come.
Mason has always been a disreputable sort, with the worst qualities a man can have, though his father praised him to the heavens.
I am aware. When I first met Mr. Verger, he spoke of his absent son in terms of glowing praise. I admit I did not know him long before I realized his thievery, and had him dealt with, but I did not expect that the son he spoke of was married to your mistress.
Mason moved to the capital on his father's coin long before you arrived at Hertford House, and Alana is not my mistress,
Hannibal insisted, reaching for his wine again, though he had never been a man to find much fortification in spirits.
Mr. Verger thought so well of his son that he sent him off to gain a fortune through marriage with every confidence Mason would succeed. Mason has always been a wastrel, a cruel and careless man without morals or restraint. However, he can be charming when he chooses to be, and he managed to worm his way into the acquaintance of the Bloom family.
I had heard that Miss Bloom was associated with the merchant family from the south of the same name, Will said, curious now about the tale. When Hannibal sent him an inquiring gaze, he clarified. No one would ever dare speak of her to me, of course, but I heard the odd bit of information betimes. I was in Hertford, Hannibal, not a cloister. That brought a smile to his husband's mouth, but the matter at hand was far too serious for him to be diverted for long.
Yes, she was associated, as well as generously dowered, and far too fine a prize for Mason to pass over, especially considering his gambling problem. He maneuvered her into a very compromising position, ensuring that the wedding would be quiet so not as to alert his creditors, and they settled in the capital about the time I returned from the war.
What a vicious thing to do, Will said, concern wrinkling his brow. He felt a pang of sympathy for her, this young woman he had tried so hard to never think of. She was not very much older than he was. She would have been younger even still when she met Mason, perhaps easily drawn into something she had no understanding of. That must have been terrifying for her, being a young lady of good background, put into such a position, trapped into a marriage with a man who had used her in such a wicked way. I cannot imagine that made for much peace within the household.
No, it certainly did not, as I was later told. Family paid her dowry on the condition that she never contact them again, and Mason accepted. He did not take advantage of the potential his marriage offered him. He continued to behave in the same reckless, selfish manner as he always had. Even when Mason's twin sister Margo was sent to live with them, did not keep him in check. He spent every penny of Alana's dowry within the year.
All of it? Will asked, stunned. One would be hard-pressed to spend even his own modest dowry within a year.
All 70,000,
Hannibal said, and had Will not become accustomed to startling things, he might have spat out his wine. He was accustomed, however, and swallowed instead, though his eyes widened with respect to the sum.
When the creditors came knocking, he abandoned both Alana and Margo. The two of them relocated to a boarding house and took in washing to live.
That must have been terribly difficult for them to adjust to, Will said, because he could imagine it all too clearly. The beloved daughter of a moneyed family and her sister-in-law, with no experience of labor, but finding themselves forced to adjust or starve. What a shame that her family would not help them. Surely, given the circumstances, they could rekindle their affections for her and set their anger aside.
She feared they would not, and fear stayed her hand,
Hannibal said, shaking his head.
She already lost their respect by the manner of her marriage, and Mason had made them no friends in his time with them. They essentially had no one to turn to.
Not even Mr. Verger. He was imprisoned by that point, Will said, grimacing at the implications.
He wouldn't have helped regardless, Hannibal assured him. Mr. Verger is a monster, whose only love is for his son. Margo was treated more like a family amusement than a daughter. Before she was sent to the capital to be civilized by her brother's heavy hand, she was rarely allowed out of the house. Even families close to the Vergers had no idea she was Mason's sister.
Will's cheeks flushed with umbrage, and his head tipped up, mouth set in that stubborn way which Hannibal immediately recognized as dangerous temper. "A family amusement, you say?" he asked, placing his wine-glass down with care.
"Most unfortunately so. She has a brilliant mind, and is so clearly her father's better. But yes, she was treated abominably. Considering your experience with your own family, you know well enough what she must have suffered."
Will's mouth tightened, but his blue eyes were vague, his mind aligning his own experiences with those of this unknown woman. "There is a kinship in suffering, is there not? It relieves me I did not inadvertently add to her troubles."
"No action you could dream of taking could have done so,"
Hannibal said, filling his glass and Will's own.
"Miss Verger knew nothing of his confinement. She is understandably not close with her father or brother."
They ate in silence a moment longer, as Will turned this information over, examining it carefully against his own perception of the situation. "And how did their paths intersect your own? 2 washerwomen and the Marquess of Clarges?" Will asked, taking another small bite of his meal. "You surely never had an occasion to become acquainted with them in your social circles, considering the circumstances." Hannibal took a sip of his wine to clear his throat before saying,
"I had no idea that Margo was in the capital, and had never set eyes on Alana in my life. It happened one evening when I was leaving my practice, as a matter of fact. A grubby little urchin ran me down and begged me to come with him as quickly as I could, saying that Miss Verger needed help and had sent for me. Miss Verger, he said, had been very insistent he tell me her name.
Will frowned and put his silverware down, Hannibal's serious tone warning him he would not like what was to come.
Naturally, I was shocked to hear there was a member of the Hartford community in the capital needing assistance, and as a physician I could not ignore a plea for help,
Hannibal said, eyes narrowing as he recalled that night. He paused then, and leaned across the table to touch Will's hand.
If you would rather not hear,
I am committed to hearing all of it, Will said, though he was nervous to know what would make Hannibal's entire body tense with mingled anger and horror. This is very personal, Hannibal. Margo and Alana, will they resent you for telling me this?
No,
Hannibal said, squeezing his fingers but not releasing him.
That is part of the reason why I went to Galley Field, Will, to make assurances that the truth of what happened to them would be safe in your hands. You are a man of great discretion whom I trust implicitly, and both Alana and Margo trust me implicitly.
That is very flattering, but... No, please, continue, Will said, grateful for the fingers that twined in his own, strong and comforting.
I arrived to refer,
Hannibal said, relaxing somewhat as he touched his spouse, drawing on his strength.
I found Mason fleeing their room, drunk and bloody. He had beaten Margo nearly to the brink of death and had most violently abused them both in a sadistic attempt to realign their preferences.
Preferences? Will asked in a harsh whisper, still fighting the disgust that filled him at the mention of such wanton, vicious violence. Even without details it was hard to shudder his empathy against it, and his stomach rebelled against his imagination. He could barely discern where his own reaction ended and Hannibal's began. His husband was so deeply disturbed.
More specifically, their preference for one another.
Miss Bloom and Miss Verger are...
Yes,
Hannibal confirmed, breathing a sigh of relief to have that much out.
For all the years that I have known them, they have lived as if married. In Mason's absence, they had expanded their friendship into love. When he returned, out of funds and resources, he tracked them down in hopes of drawing on Alana's family on the pretext of earning their forgiveness. He did not expect to find Alana and Margo were comfortably domestic without him. Brute that he is, he took exception.
While not acquainted with the workings of a beta female body, Will was well acquainted enough with his own to know what methods a monster like Mason Verger would use to assert himself over two women he felt offended him, and he bent every bit of his formidable will against his helpless imagination. Hannibal squeezed his hand again, a grounding force against his gift, a paddle in the river of his raging imagination.
He abused them both equally,
Hannibal said, his emphasis making Will blanch and turn his face away, eyes closed and heart aching for them both. Alana, tricked into a marriage she did not want, to a monster she could not escape. Margo, abused by a father and brother who should have loved her. Both of them found solace and love in each other's arms, and the world saw fit to crush them, as if their feelings and desires were irrelevant in a society which catered to men and their violent appetites. It filled Will's heart as much with aching sympathy as it did outrage on their behalf.
Had the situation not been so dire, I would have been ill with it,
Hannibal admitted, smoothing his thumb over Will's knuckles as much to soothe himself as Will.
I didn't have the luxury to indulge my disgust. Instead, I found myself having to decide whether to engage Mason and hold him liable for what he'd done, or save his sister's life.
That is hardly a choice.
No, not by half. I decided to tend to the missus. I was not certain I would save Margo, but somehow I did. By the time she was stable, Mason was long gone. The constables refused to maintain order in that section of the city, and their neighbours were the sort who never involved themselves in the affairs of others.
Will paled and quietly took a swallow of his wine, sickened by what little Hannibal had shared. He was not ignorant of the evils that men could visit on those around them, and his knowledge only made it all the more appalling. That is indescribably vile. Thank you for keeping the details vague for my sake.
For my own as well as yours. It was a terrible sight I have no desire to revisit in any way. They were so profoundly hurt they could not care for one another and had no one to turn to. I had them taken to a cenobium and saw to their care until they were well enough to make the trip to Galleyfield.
Will absorbed that, nodding without realizing he had done so. He curled his fingers into Hannibal's and said, "That was a very kind thing to do, Hannibal, taking them away somewhere safe to be cared for. You could hardly save their lives and turn them out on the street."
I couldn't. Margo was born in Hartford. She is one of ours, even still.
That is why she sent the boy for you, insisting he tell you her name, because she knew who you were, both as a man and a physician. She trusted you would help her, if only by virtue of your position.
Yes. She was frightened, have no doubt about that. She was terrified of even the sight of me, but it was Alanna she feared for, and she trusted that, as one who still numbered on the register of Hartford, I would fill my duty to her as her lord, and use my power to aid her.
A noble, solemn charge, Will breathed, admiring the way Hannibal had not hesitated to fill the service that was expected of him. Margo had reached out to him as a supplicant to a lord, invoking a promise that could not be broken. That was the ancient foundation of their class system.
I promised them both that I would protect them. I promised that they would remain safely under my care for as long as they needed. I was determined that they would never face such terror again, and I always keep my promises.
And so you became their benefactor, Will murmured, so much of the gossip finding new meaning with this recounting. Yet Mason remains free to this day. How is it that a man is free to enact such evil as he pleases, and not be punished for it?
He ran away to save himself,
Hannibal said, simply and directly, only the tightening of his shoulders betraying his irritation.
Margo begged me to forget the entirety of it. She had no wish for the details to be made public, but I could not allow such a wrong to remain unpunished. I made arrangements to handle things discreetly, and was informed Mason had fled to the continent. I engaged a man by the name of Tyr to keep track of his whereabouts, and contented myself with the knowledge that he could not reach them where I sent them, leaving the rest in their hands.
"Given them your name to shield them," Will said, drawing a deep breath, all that he'd learned settling deep into his mind. "And your daughter? She came after you first took up with Miss Bloom?"
"Yes, Marissa, my daughter,"
Hannibal said, rubbing his forehead with a small wince.
"Alanna and Margo lived quietly at Galleyfield without incident, but that is where I've always spent my free time, away from the capital. When the season ended, I retired to the country and joined them."
"And the rumors regarding Alanna began, of course," Will said, recalling all too clearly the society column announcing Lord Clarges had taken to the country with a mysterious dark-haired female. The negotiations for the rail had started that day, and how passionately he had argued his case, fueled by the knowledge that his husband's name was linked with yet another woman, a woman who had never been his mistress. It made him doubt everything he had heard the past 6 years.
"There was no avoiding the rumors,"
Hannibal said, searching Will's expression and finding nothing more than thoughtful contemplation.
"Once it quickly became apparent Alanna was pregnant. Far too quickly, in fact."
"God, she's Mason's daughter!" He could hear his father's voice, his harsh, barking laughter, could feel his disbelief and disdain, mocking Will's easy trust in the truth of Hannibal's words. But he could feel no lie from Hannibal, could feel nothing but the bitterness of what had happened to 2 women alone in the world, at the mercy of a heartless man. He lifted his gaze to Hannibal's and said with more strength, "The little girl, your daughter, she is Mason's child."
"Yes. In terms of paternity, she is Mason's daughter, though we hope she will never need to know such a thing. Allowing the world to believe Marissa was my daughter created much more distance between the missus and Mason."
"And you had no thought to what I might think?" Will asked, though he knew he was rubbing a lemon on his own cut with that question.
"At the time, when I thought of you, I thought of the Omega who'd wheedled my birthright out of my grandfather in less than 2 days,"
Hannibal said, his features taut and tight.
"You know all too well how unforgiving and unforgivable I was. You know I would change it all if I could, Will."
Will thought he might let go of Hannibal's hand, but he didn't. He held fast, instead clinging to the man before him, to erase the man he'd been.
"And here is where I confess more of the things that shame me. I know you are aware of my activities when I first returned to the capital."
"Yes," Will said. I shuddered, his form in still repose, but expectant, waiting. "You took a mistress the moment you arrived."
"I did,"
Hannibal said, a dark flush on his cheeks.
"I was deprived of such company in my years away at war, and I sought comforts that had been denied to me. I was disappointed in the result, and understood then why I did not suffer for its absence while away at war. I do not say to offer an excuse, Will, merely to be honest."
Will frowned. "Failing your expectations, you endeavor to try and try again?" Hannibal subsided, chastened, and said,
"No, Will. I realize it may come as something of a shock, considering all you have heard, but the result of my disappointment was to confirm that I have never been particularly interested in carnal pursuits."
"If even so moral a person such as I must have other appetites, Hannibal," Will reminded him, recalling their conversation, "then surely that must apply to an alpha of your lineage."
"I spent 10 years at war without options that appealed to me, Will, and it was no great hardship. I have been seen in the company of many women, yes, but for a purpose, and it was not that. If a woman spent the night untouched in my bed, that was certainly not the story she told her friends."
Will angled a flat look at him, and almost did withdraw his hand then. "Are you attempting to tell me you slept in the same bed as a woman, and did not take advantage?"
"The best way to avoid a person bent on becoming my lover is to seem otherwise engaged. I will not lie to you and say that I have always been entirely chaste since my return, as there were a few rare occasions where I acted impulsively,"
Hannibal said, holding Will's gaze despite his discomfort in speaking so plainly to his husband.
"But those were rare occasions indeed. Nothing like the gossips insist. Anatomy is a tricky business for alphas."
Hannibal expected Will to blush. He didn't. "You do not seem all that indifferent to me, Lord Clarges," Will said, testing his bond to Hannibal, but finding no lie.
"I think perhaps it is because my tastes lie elsewhere,"
Hannibal said, and that brought a blush to Will's cheeks.
"Alana came to my rescue. Once the world believed she was my favorite, I was content to remain unbothered by the nuisance of those who wished to better make my acquaintance through an absence of clothing."
"Hannibal!" Will said, appalled by his phrasing, eyes flying wide.
"I apologize. I did not mean to offend you."
Will gave him a warning look from beneath the long curl of his lashes that soon became meditative and considering. "They saved you from the inconvenience of would-be mistresses, and the husband you despised, and you gave them a home and the protection of your position."
"Yes,"
Hannibal said, fondling the fine fingers in his grasp, seeking what comfort Will would grant him. "You did not go to Galley Field simply to beg their blessing to tell me this story, Hannibal," Will said, cocking his head in question. "And even I know that you cannot keep them where they are, and hope to still have the rumors that she is your mistress. And I will have those rumors stilled, Hannibal. I am not prone to vanity, but I will not have those in your acquaintance think so little of me as that man at Fernhill does."
"Thomas Marlowe is a fool who exaggerates everything he hears,"
Hannibal said, annoyed by even the thought of him.
"Of course I would not disrespect you, Will. The misses are taking a cottage near the seaside attached to a garrison, where a friend of mine will look after them and see to their safety. He's a captain there, and has the manpower to keep them safe."
Will nodded, a soft exhale of relief escaping him. "The details you settled."
"I wanted to assure them I would not abandon them to their own resources as far as income. The cost of their care comes from my personal accounts and will not diminish what is yours. Though I know you would never begrudge them."
"No, I hadn't even considered such," Will admitted, and fixed Hannibal with a weighty stare. "You will treat me as your equal, as your spouse?"
"I have put all else aside. I will have no company but yours, Will, and need no other to content me. I have made arrangements for those who depend on me, and I have returned to you with the intentions of dedicating myself to your happiness."
"But what of the babe she carries now?" Will asked, confusion wrinkling his brow, doubt threatening to rise to the surface. "To whom does he belong?"
They offered to tell me, but I felt it was no business of mine,
Hannibal said, shifting with discomfort at what he knew was to come.
I do not know, but he is not mine.
But you intended him to be, Will softly said, his blue eyes meeting Hannibal's. Didn't you? Hannibal swallowed hard, his tongue touching his lower lip, the tips of his heavy alpha fangs bared in a soft frown of distaste. His nod was barely discernible, but was a nod none the less. The implications of it struck Will with a force. He looked at Hannibal, just gazed at him with that understanding shining in his vivid blue eyes, and said with a quiet distance, "You would rather name a stranger's child as your heir than any child of mine."
"I don't want one from you. I cannot, in fact, think of anything I want less."
The memory of those words hung between them, and Will pulled away, retreating into his stiff reserve to analyze the ache that pushed through him, that sought to rend the small thread of hope that had sprung up between them.
There was a time, yes, when I had intended to use that child to satisfy my grandfather with the full understanding on all sides that I would make my own arrangements for allocating the inheritance once he had passed,
Hannibal said, hoping his words would keep his spouse near him.
I have made decisions over the past 6 years that, looking back on them now, appall me to my very core.
He surged to his feet and moved around the table to crouch at Will's side, imploring,
"Knowing you now as I do, I would never take such rash and unforgivable actions. I would never allow myself to behave in such a shameful fashion or with such a gross display of selfish arrogance. I admit it, and will always claim the return for my folly. You deserve to know the truth of things."
"For what reason?" Will asked, keeping himself under tight control, but looking down into his husband's face, so beautiful that a lesser man might forgive him anything, if only to win his smile. But Will was not a man, nor a woman. He was only himself, and it would take more than Hannibal's aristocratic features to do him in.
"Because I meant everything I said to you, Will,"
Hannibal said, amber eyes bright with passion.
"Because I would, with your permission, wish to remain at Hertford House and be your husband in more than name."
Will just gazed at him, silent and safe behind the locked doors of his defenses, and even as Hannibal knelt before him, he could feel Will moving steadily deeper into the fortress he had built to protect himself.
"I would bring our shattered potential together, as I promised,"
Hannibal said, eyes fierce with the force of his conviction.
"I should like to be your husband, Will, in truth."
"Truth," Will breathed, the word escaping him in his upset. 6 years, and a scheme to deceive your grandfather, and now you wish to be my husband in truth. You cannot simply change your mind, Lord Clarges. Life doesn't work that way."
"What if I have?"
Hannibal asked, noting the hot color that flooded Will's cheeks.
"What if life did, in fact, work that way? What would you change your mind about, Will?"
Will's mouth parted. He fell into bewildered silence, the question hurtling him backwards through his life to find a decision he would change. The realization of what he found there drained the anger right out of him. Feeling fragile and worn, he said with all the stiff dignity at his disposal, "You're right, of course, Lord Clarges. I have always depended on the alphas in my life to make my decisions. There is nothing I would change my mind about, because I have never been given the autonomy to decide in the first place. Why should this be any different? Why should there be consequences for you having abandoned me for 6 years without a backward glance, and plotted to set a child who isn't even yours as your heir, rather than one born from a construct of meager appeal, housing a vapid, empty mind and lack of true purpose outside of getting bedded?"
"There are consequences, Will,"
Hannibal said, flinching from the harshness of his own words, said with such hateful conviction at the time. He made an abortive movement to touch him, but remembered himself and dropped his hand.
"There have been consequences, and unfortunately we both have to live with them. It is not fair."
"When is life ever fair?" Will glared at him, trembling with rage.
"The fact of the matter is that you do have a choice, and I will never take that from you,"
Hannibal said, squaring his shoulders, determined to be heard.
When I think of the actions I took, and the spite with which I took them, I am ashamed, Will. Yet I will confess it all to gain your trust, and flood you with apologies. You know that I regret what I have done, Will. My words to you at Hertford were not a lie. The tears I shed before you were honest. I meant every word I said to you, I swear it.
He shifted up to stand at Will's side, amber eyes filled with emotion, pleading.
I am flawed, Will. I am a prideful man, and arrogant, and I think too well of myself most times to think very well of others. But if you will have me, unworthy as I am, in so many respects, I promise that you will never regret it, and perhaps we can find together what we have missed in one another.
What if I refuse you? Will murmured, turning his head away to give Hannibal his profile, perfect and lovely with his snub of a nose and his stubborn chin and every exquisite detail that was stamped on Hannibal's heart as surely as it was in his memory. Your statement implies there is another option, Lord Clarges. Tell me what it is.
The other option is what it has always been,
Hannibal said, unable to keep the soft thread of displeasure out of his voice.
To give my grandfather an heir, and part ways to our respective lives, mine in the capital, and yours at Hertford House, to be strangers to one another again. The Lector line must continue, and I can say with utter honesty I will have no children elsewhere.
Will lowered his head, amazed to find that it hurt so much to consider losing his husband for good and all.
I would leave you, if you so wished, to raise the child without knowing me, though it would pain me terribly to do so.
Will took a deep breath, struggling against what he'd been told.
The things I said to you, the beliefs I held. I haven't changed my mind, Will. You have changed it for me,
Hannibal said, desperate to reach him.
Do you still see the man I was in the man who stands before you?
Will looked up at him, with those wounded, unyielding eyes, his back ramrod straight and his shoulders squared, for all the world as if he might reach for the nearest heavy object and fling it at Hannibal's head. Hannibal was entirely certain he deserved it, should Will decide to do so.
You turned a mirror on my heart, and made me see the ugliness it held,
Hannibal said, and knelt again, daring to touch Will's soft cheek, the barest brush of calloused fingertips in a caress that lifted goosebumps with its tenderness. Hannibal's voice was soft and sincere when he confessed,
You have given me something far more beautiful to take its place, and it has found a home there.
Will could feel the sincerity coming from him, the painful ache of hope that expected to be denied. How well he knew that feeling, bitter to its depths, a self-inflicted wound that humans seemed infatuated with causing themselves.
The future,
Hannibal said, wetting his dry lips, a tremble coursing through him when he thought of how much hinged on this moment,
is and will always be yours to choose.
Will considered the man before him, the same man who had treated him so terribly in the beginning, the same man who had snubbed him and ignored him and abandoned him. He was also the same man who had so tenderly kissed his scars, who had flown into a rage when he'd been hurt, who had openly condemned his father for the way he'd been treated. A man who'd carried him without complaint, confessed his regrets for abandoning Will to gossip and conjecture, who had dressed him in his nightshirt and knelt before him with warmth in his upturned eyes. This was the same man who had wept before him, unguarded and repentant, who had admitted to his wrongs and owned his mistakes, who kissed his hand and insisted he was beautiful even when he wasn't, if only to make him smile. Will asked himself if he was willing to be the one who would turn his back on their potential this time. If he would, for the sake of his pride, turn Hannibal away for another 6 years, and take cold comfort in knowing that he might have hurt him as much as Hannibal had hurt him so long ago. Or if, instead, he was capable of finding room in his heart to forgive what his husband had done in his misguided, self-righteous cruelty, and seek the happiness Hannibal hoped to return in excess of his expectations. The very same happiness that life had always denied him, and Hannibal would defy the gods themselves to have, if it suited him. Will reached out and lay his hand against his husband's cheek, his heart skipping at the way Hannibal leaned into his touch, capturing his hand as if he feared Will might pull away. When I was a little boy, I would go down to the riverside alone, Will said, fixing his gaze on the silver box that reflected the golden candlelight, his thumb smoothing over Hannibal's high cheekbones. I would pick flowers along the way, one for every painful thought, one for every angry response I could never give, one for each frustration. Hannibal said nothing, but his breathing shallowed in an attempt to keep his heart from pounding with hope. I would take those flowers and wade into the river, Will said, blinking rapidly against remembered emotion. One by one, I would put them in the current and watch the river take them away. I used to wish I could be taken away as they were, pulled from my life by the eddying current into the unknown. He looked at Hannibal, then, soft and reflective, but firm. I have let go of things you cannot imagine, Will told him, his tight smile somber and haunted. Somehow, I've always managed to keep myself, even if the damage remains. It will always remain, Hannibal. Hannibal dropped his gaze, mouth tightening with pain. Some things are simply beyond repair. Hannibal steeled himself to accept it, his disappointment already so vast he was not entirely certain he would be able to bear it, though he knew he would stay to ensure Will's safety from the threat that seemed so determined to end him.
Our scars are the reflections of a life lived, a map of ourselves etched into flesh and soul,
Hannibal said, his voice soft and pitched low, yet it was still a struggle to raise his eyes to meet Will's, to see the wounds he'd left reflected back at him, an ugly pattern of his own design. I am more than a sum of my scars, Will said, steady and firm. In a somber, slow cadence, he softly said, What you have done for the Mrs. Bloom and Vergers, very commendable, Hannibal. Please, do not think from my reactions that I find any fault whatsoever in the actions you took, except as they pertain to myself. The fingers resting on Hannibal's cheek tightened, but did not withdraw. It was not easy hearing of your exploits for the past 6 years. Knowing that they were exaggerated, hearing you readily admit that you regret the actions you took, it dampens my pain and anger somewhat. He held Hannibal's gaze, his own unflinching but still welling with the melancholy that Hannibal had sworn to never see again. You said you would try with everything in you to bring it back together again. You said that if it took the rest of your life, you would never stop trying.
I did. I promise you that I meant every word, Will.
We must always strive to overcome that which seeks to deprive us of what little joy the world so grudgingly gives, Will said, and took a deep breath before letting it out again. If I am to decide the future for us both, Hannibal, then I suppose I should allow you to try your hardest to show me why I should decide in your favor. The surprised pleasure that filled Hannibal's uplifted eyes only amplified the vibration of happiness and hope that Will felt through his bond. I would like to begin anew, Hannibal, in the hopes that friendship can provide what force and circumstance could not, Will told him, certain that Hannibal would not refuse him, not now. I cannot promise I can forgive you just yet, but like you, I can promise I will try. Hannibal's smile was soft and hesitant, and his voice was the tiniest bit unsteady when he whispered,
I should like that very much, Will. I promise you that you shall not regret this.
He turned his mouth against Will's hand and kissed his palm, prepared to be reprimanded, but pleased when he was not. Hannibal's earnest amber eyes met his, and Will's solemn expression gave way to the slightest of smiles when Hannibal solemnly swore,
And I always keep my promises.